Kate Masur, our next speaker, is a professor at Northwestern University at Evanston. And as I was telling her earlier, I have been reading her book. I read one chapter, the Illinois chapter, on the topic of African-American political involvement pre-Civil War in what would be the Northwest Territory, but Illinois specifically. There's a reason why it was the finalist for a Pulitzer Prize in history, and there's no question about it. It's fresh material, new material, or material that's been ignored for all these many years, and she's going to talk about that with us today, and I think you'll find it very entertaining. The book, Until Justice Be Done, America's First Civil Rights Movement from the Revolution to Reconstruction, is the name of the book. I should also mention that she has a second a book right after that has come out called Freedom Was in Sight, A Graphic History of Reconstruction in the Washington, D.C. region, which is, you'll think a graphic book, history book. Well, we're a visual people, and I'm sure this will help appeal to younger readers, but it also appeals to old guys like me too. It's really quite a very good book. It has some graphic and images, plus all the footnotes and all the text that you'd ever want in a book like this. So I would highly recommend you think about buying that for yourself and your children or grandchildren. So think about that. So with that, I bring up Kate Masur.
All right, thank you. Hi, everyone. Let's see. Can I get the slideshow? Oh, perfect. Okay, good afternoon. So it's really great to be here, and I'm really honored to speak here at the Abraham Lincoln Association. And the final speaker of the day always has the challenge of, keeping folks awake after lunch. But hopefully I'll have some things that are of interest. And thank you so much, Bill, for that really nice introduction and for really a perfect segue into what I'm going to talk about. One of the things that many historians have been doing and thinking about over many years really is when we study history, telling a more complete story maybe than what traditionally was told about the history of this country. And I think one of the things I wanted to start out by saying is kind of echoing a little bit what Tim Good was talking about earlier today. In many ways, the history of the United States is a history of arguments and conflicts and struggles, and it's not a particularly peaceful or smooth history. It's a history of conflict, and that's all right. I mean, I don't think there's anything wrong with saying that, and I think actually thinking about it that way helps us understand the really conflictual times that we're living in now, that in some ways Americans fighting over major issues about the future of our country and what kind of a democracy we want to be is, nothing new, right? And in many ways, it's our responsibility, like people did in the past, to get involved in those struggles because it really matters. So I think that's sort of a precursor to what I'm going to talk about today. Just a little bit more about me. I got into this world of Lincoln scholarship through an interest in Reconstruction. So I wrote my dissertation as a graduate student at the University of Michigan on the history of Reconstruction in the Washington, D.C. region, in Washington, D.C. proper. And through that, of course, I wrote about Lincoln because Lincoln, for example, signed into law the D.C. Emancipation Act of 1862. Lincoln was a presence in Washington as part of his own daily life during the Civil War, during his presidency. And I also started teaching around the time of Lincoln's 200th birthday at Northwestern. I started teaching a class called Abraham Lincoln in History and Memory. So in that class, we both talked about Lincoln in his own time, but also the kinds of things that Tim was talking about earlier about how Lincoln was later remembered, how he was memorialized, what he came to stand for to different people at different times in American history. So I've always been really interested in Reconstruction, and my book, Until Justice Be Done, from 2021, was actually a book that tried to explain how it was that the Republicans of the Civil War period ended up believing in the things they believed in. So, when we talk about how, Lincoln believed in the abolition of slavery, He believed in equal civil rights for black people and white people. He eventually came to believe that at least some African American men should have the right to vote. How did Republicans like Lincoln even come to those views, right? And we might ask that question, especially given the history that Tim, again, discussed earlier, that this was a country that was founded with slavery at the heart of its economy. This was a country that was founded with the dispossession of Native Americans very much at the core of it. And so if you think of all of the forces, just to turn American history on its head a little, like if you think of all of the forces in American history that were pushing in the direction of this being a very racist country, then how do we actually get, we might ask the question of how do we actually get particularly white Americans who might well have been invested in those ideas to not be? That's a question worth asking. And we shouldn't take for granted that they did turn out that way. And so that question of how we ended up with, in 1860, a major political party in the United States that was going to come into power in Washington, D.C., and actually try to end slavery and actually try to pass civil rights laws that protected black people equally as white people, to me that was a question that needed answering. And I didn't feel like any historian had really answered that question as well as I would have liked to have seen. And so that is kind of what I tried to do in that book. So what I'm going to do today is talk about pieces of that book, Until Justice Be Done, but I'm going to also throw in pieces that are not in the book about Illinois. So my focus is going to be on Illinois. And I want to start with this Black Men's Convention that occurred in Chicago in 1853. About 40 black men gathered in Chicago in October of 1853, coming from all over this state and some from outside of the state. And the headliner, the keynote address, was given by a guy named Frederick Douglass. You may have heard of him. Unfortunately, what he said that day is not recorded. The newspapers, I guess, weren't that interested. They did note that he spoke in Chicago and that he was well received, but we don't know exactly what he said. But at this convention, there were separate breakout sessions and subcommittees where African American men discussed education, economic progress, but above all, they discussed how best to protest Illinois' oppressive anti-black laws. So black residents of Illinois in this period were denied access to public education, to the courts, and to the right to vote. State laws cast black residents basically as outsiders, as people who were not really wanted here. And the laws were really designed to not only marginalize African Americans who already lived here, but also discourage people from migrating into the state by saying, if you come here, you're not going to be able to have all of the rights that white people enjoyed. So this convention had lively discussions of how to fight back against those laws. And at the end, one of the declarations the convention made was, we stand only for even-handed justice. And the convention was part of what I call the first civil rights movement. So the subtitle of my book, America's First Civil Rights Movement, is about how black and white Northerners in the decades before the Civil War pushed back against racist policies in the northern states, and how from that movement they set the stage for what the Republicans would do in federal power once they came into federal power in the 1860s. The most consistent and most dedicated participants in this first civil rights movement were black Northerners. And when we study this movement, we get to know a whole cast of characters who go well beyond the most famous black Americans like Frederick Douglass or Harriet Tubman. So in Illinois, for example, you have people like John Jones, who many people, I think probably in this room, have heard of. He's probably the most famous black Illinoisan of this period. And also Henry Wagner, another very interesting person, and many, many other people who have fascinating sort of biographical stories. People who were fighting in this movement also needed white allies. African Americans in most northern states could not vote. Black men could not vote. And so if you wanted to change policy in your state, you really needed to have white voters on your side. So part of the movement was also about gathering white allies and trying to find white people who would support this movement for civil rights. So this talk is going to be about both Illinois' anti-black laws and the fight against them. All right, there's the book. Some of what I'm going to talk about today is drawn not from the book, but from a project I did after the book came out in 2021. So there's a lot of the book is about the Midwest, but most of the Midwestern material in the book is actually about Ohio. And then there's a chapter that has a great deal of information about Illinois, which is also the chapter that kind of leads into the Civil War. So it has the Lincoln-Douglas debates and the rise of Lincoln. But I had a lot of stuff about Illinois kind of on the cutting room floor after the book was done. And I then had the opportunity to kind of teach a class about Illinois history and work with this project that's actually based at Penn State University called the Colored Conventions Project. So we made this website that is about African American history of Illinois in the 1840s and 50s. So this is a history that a lot of people don't know that much about because many people think, you know, black history in Illinois starts with the Great Migration or something like that. And so we wanted, this is a website that is freely accessible and it's got a huge amount of research and information on it about African American settlements in Illinois, the black laws, black political mobilization. And then one of my favorite parts of it is actually that it has 20 profiles of individual men and women who were involved in that movement. Now, the men were more like they went to the convention. The women were playing more supporting roles because of the way that gender relations worked at that time. But we researched and wrote 20 profiles of individual people. So some of what I'm talking about is from this as well, and I would love for you to explore that and have a look at it. Okay, so just to step back, so I do think that it's worth talking about Illinois as part of the Northwest Territory, right? The states that were carved out of the Northwest Territory had particular kind of shared history and particular things in common, even though they had a lot of differences as well. So in 1787, Congress designates that whole area that's marked in a square as the Northwest Territory and declared slavery to be outlawed there. Slavery already existed in a lot of places in the Northwest Territory, and so it wasn't like straightforward how they were then going to enforce the idea that slavery is no longer legal when a lot of people actually already own slaves there. And so that remained to be worked out, and as many of you will know, there was a big battle in Illinois in the teens about whether to actually try to legalize slavery as the state became a state. Ohio was the first state the first kind of territory to become a state out of the Northwest Territory. It was a big deal, I should say, that the Northwest Territory barred slavery in this huge territory, right? This was the first actual kind of clearly anti-slavery measure taken by the United States government. And, you know, there's a lot we could say about the mixed messages if you go back to the founding about, you know, did the founders of this country support slavery? Did they not? There are lots of indications that they did, and they allowed for the expansion of slavery, and there are lots of indications that they didn't because they barred slavery in the entire Northwest Territory. On the other hand, the states in the lower three states of the Old Northwest, Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, as they became territories and states, proceeded to pass laws that were harshly discriminatory toward black Americans. So in other words, we really have to, and I think a lot of people do a good job with this with Lincoln, we really have to think about the distinction between opposing slavery and supporting racial equality, right? So you can certainly oppose slavery and think it's wrong, and at the same time support racial segregation, support deportation of people you don't like, right? So there's a difference, because people may oppose slavery for a lot of different reasons that don't necessarily include supporting racial equality. So all of these states, Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio, as they became states, they placed restrictions on the legal settlement of African Americans. They required black people who lived in the states to register with county officials so that their presence was known, unlike whites who did not have to register. They put penalties on employers who hired people who were illegally in the state, right? So they tried to disincentivize employers from hiring those people. They did not allow African Americans to testify in court cases involving white people, and that included like civil cases, right? So, for example, in a labor relationship, if you were an African American person and you were working for a white person and you had a labor contract, right? Like at the end of this amount of time, you will pay me this amount of money, and then the employer came around and said, "Oh well, we never signed that," or like, "I don't know where that contract is. I'm not paying you." The black person couldn't go to court. They had no recourse, even in situations like that, because of these laws. Black children, the schools that these states established said that the public education was for white children, right? So black children were excluded from public education for the most part. And then the state constitutions said that the right to vote was for white men only. So by state constitution, black men were not allowed to vote. Why were these laws on the books? And also why, it's actually true that in statehood, Michigan and Wisconsin didn't really pass these laws except for the black men's disenfranchisement. So why did Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio pass these laws when the upper Northwest states did not? Because these states bordered, I'll show you again, on the Ohio River. And south of the Ohio River were the slave states. And so the legislators in these states were particularly worried about black migration from the slave states up into these free states, right? So they faced a concern about migration that they considered to be distinctive and particularly threatening, that there was never a consensus by the time Michigan and Wisconsin were coming into the states that was that big of a deal, okay? And this was talked about freely, by the way, about the threat of migration of black people, whether they were escaping slaves, so people who were like fugitives from slavery, or whether they were free African Americans just migrating into a place where they would have more rights. The legislators who supported these black laws in the lower Midwest didn't care what the reason was. They just wanted to have a predominantly white population. This cartoon I like to show because it illustrates both the rhetoric around these black laws and also the opposition to them. So this is a cartoon that's criticizing the idea that black migrants are going to be a dependent class who are not a desirable class to have in your state. So the cartoon depicts 4 African American men working very hard. And in the background, you can't see it very well, but there's a woman doing washing in the background. And then you have, so they're all working hard. And then you have a leisurely white couple on the left-hand side walking by. The woman's got a parasol. And then what does the caption say? The caption says, "Poor things, they can't take care of themselves." So the rhetoric is the white people commenting on the black people saying, "Oh, they can't take care of themselves. When they come into this state, they become dependent on public resources. They are just a drain on our society." But of course, the cartoon itself is contradicting that by showing that the African American people are working very hard. They most certainly can take care of themselves, and the white people are the ones who aren't working in this picture, right? And so this cartoon is part of the ideas that are implicit in the first civil rights movement, right? That it is incorrect, it's a racial stereotype to sort of characterize black people, black migrants, as being lazy, as not working, and this was often the case, that's how they were characterized, that's a stereotype and it's not true, and that, we need to understand that African Americans should not be subjected to these kind of laws and should have the right to mobility and to work and to move where they want within the United States. By the way, I should add, I'm getting a little ahead of myself. The black laws of the Old Northwest were not considered to be a violation of the United States Constitution. Okay, so I don't know if anyone was thinking when I talked about those laws, well, how could they have those laws? Did anyone think that, by the way? Did anyone think, like, how is it constitutional to have laws that explicitly discriminate against black people at the state level? Because now you cannot have that, right? Like, you cannot have laws that say black people need to register, right, when they don't also apply to white people. Any kind of race-based legislation like that is unconstitutional. But it is unconstitutional under the 14th Amendment, which was ratified in 1868, right? It was not considered unconstitutional under the original Constitution. So the states have so much autonomy in this period to violate people's rights in ways that would later, fast forwarding to the future, right, in which I will get to by the end of this, states have all this latitude to do all kinds of things that we would now think are A, unconstitutional, and B, quite immoral. Okay, so how did people fight back against these laws, right? So the people who were most negatively affected by these policies in the Midwest were African Americans, but they were always a very small part of the population, about 1% of the population of Ohio, for example. And also black men were denied the right to vote, so they couldn't exercise their political or express their political views through voting. So what were the tactics of the first civil rights movement, which was trying to protest against these kind of policies? So here I want to switch and talk a bit more about Illinois. You all know about the murder of Elijah Lovejoy in Alton in 1837. I hope you also know about Zabina Eastman, an editor who moved here after that occurrence. Do you all know about Zabina Eastman? Lincoln appointed him a consul in England. He was of Lincoln's milieu, and later, when Lincoln's president, Eastman gets some kind of diplomatic appointment. So Eastman was originally from New England. He was a newspaper editor. After Lovejoy's murder, an older kind of elderly abolitionist editor named Benjamin Lundy moved here to Illinois to show the world that you could publish an abolitionist newspaper in Illinois. It was a kind of in-your-face to the mob that murdered Lovejoy. So Lundy moved to Illinois, and then Eastman, who was a much younger man, moved to Illinois too to help Lundy publish an abolitionist newspaper in Illinois. So this is one of the seeds of this kind of early civil rights movement in this state. Eastman goes on to publish a newspaper called the Western Citizen. By the way, I want to tell you that the Western Citizen is held by the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum, but was recently digitized by the Illinois Digital Newspapers Project. So now it's available digitally and with no paywall through that newspaper project. And it is an awesome source for this kind of history, for the history of abolitionism in Illinois and the anti-slavery movement in Illinois, for the history of African Americans in Illinois. And I have to say that over the last several years, a lot of 19th century newspapers have been digitized, and they've really changed how we can research and understand this history. And when the Western Citizen hadn't been digitized, it really left a gap, because there was a similar paper in Ohio, in Cincinnati, called The Philanthropist, that was digitized at the time that I was working on my book, and it had tremendous amounts of information about the Liberty Party and the Free Soil movement in Ohio, and abolitionism in Ohio, and African Americans in Ohio. And having The Philanthropist digitized was amazing. And I was at the time noticing that how much we were missing out on because the Western Citizen, which had similar kind of coverage, had not been digitized. And now it has, and so I encourage everyone to look at it. So one of the things that the Western Citizen under Zabina Eastman's directorship did was, so they got involved in campaigning to get the Illinois legislature to repeal these terrible laws. And this is one of the things they did. They would print petition forms like this, okay, in the newspaper, and you could cut these out and paste it on a piece of paper and then go around to your neighbors and get them to sign the petition. So this says, to the Senate and House of Representatives of the State of Illinois, the undersigned, citizens of the State of Illinois, respectfully pray your honorable body to pass a law granting a trial by jury to all persons where liberty is at stake, and that is jury trial for accused fugitive slaves, and to repeal the law which justifies the imprisonment of all persons without charge of crime, and to repeal all other laws which operate to oppress our fellow men on account of color. So this kind of petition is part of this first civil rights movement, and it shows how people mobilized to try to make their voices heard, especially when they were in a political minority and where the people most affected didn't even have the right to vote. And you see these petitions published in many issues of the Western Citizen. Now, Illinois was going through an interesting time in the late 1840s and early 1850s. Illinois was a very heavily Democratic state at the time. And so, backtrack for a second. So, okay, so a lot of states are making new constitutions at this time. Also in the lower Midwest, these black laws are constantly being kind of pushed back against. Illinois meets to draft a new constitution in 1848, right? And they debate whether to put a black exclusion measure in the Constitution. So many representatives at the state constitutional convention want the new constitution to have a provision that totally excludes African Americans from migrating into the state. And they debate it very openly, and you can see it for yourself in the published debates about the state constitutional convention. In the end, what they do is they say that they're instructing the legislature in the future to pass such a law excluding black migration. And then when they send the Constitution out for a vote by the citizens of the state of Illinois, they separate the whole Constitution from the black exclusion measure so people can vote on them separately. So the Constitution passes, the black exclusion measure also passes. At this time, okay, John Jones and Mary Richardson Jones are becoming active in Illinois politics. And I want to say a little bit about John Jones because this is the beginning of a long and very effectual political career that he had. Jones first makes his mark that we know of on Illinois politics by writing about why the Illinois black law should be repealed while the convention is going on, the constitutional convention is going on in the summer of 1847. He publishes a couple of articles in the newly founded Chicago Tribune saying these laws are unjust, they should be repealed. Okay? Of course, the convention is going to go in the other direction. But John Jones, and I want to say a little more about him, like many black residents of Illinois at that time, he and his wife, Mary, were migrants from southern states. So Jones was actually born in North Carolina. He had been taken to Memphis, Tennessee, as a tailor's apprentice. And then in 1841, he met Mary Richardson in Memphis, and then her family moved out of Tennessee to Alton, Illinois, and then John Jones moved to Alton in 1841, probably because he wanted to be closer to Mary. And there they got married, and they had a baby daughter named Lavinia, and they moved to Chicago in 1845. And Jones, he always said later that they had $2 to their name when they moved to Chicago. We have the record of the certificates that they had to carry showing that they were legitimately free people and entitled to live in the state of Illinois. Those papers still exist. Jones was somewhat literate at the time and then increasingly learned to write. It is said with the education of white abolitionists in Chicago, and he becomes really the most famous black Illinoisan of his era, and also a very prosperous property owner in Chicago. They opened their homes to people who were running away from slavery. He even wrote in the 1850s, he wrote openly about the operations of the Underground Railroad in Chicago for Frederick Douglass's newspaper. I want to say one other thing about that photo. So the Chicago History Museum has oil paintings of them from later in life and a couple of portraits of them when they were older. And then this photo came to life because it was posted on the internet by a descendant of theirs. And so it is on the Wikipedia page, but that photo remained in their family. And I appreciate you pointing out how some of the facets of their clothing. I mean, when he moved to Chicago, before he got really involved in real estate, he was working as a tailor. And as his tailor business grew, he also employed white people as tailor's assistants. So he was really became a big shot. I've wondered if this is their wedding picture, in which case it was before they got, he became really prosperous. But that doesn't mean he wouldn't have had access to a really nice fabric. And so I appreciate that. So basically what I want to summarize here is that on the one hand, the first civil rights movement is making progress in Ohio. So Ohio is really getting kind of to the point where, for a variety of reasons, including that it's very evenly divided between Whigs and Democrats, it is possible through political maneuvering to repeal most of the black laws in the state of Ohio. Not all of them, but most of them in 1849. So on the one hand, you see in the example of Ohio kind of progress that's being made by this movement. On the other hand, you see in a place like Illinois and a place like Indiana how difficult it is, especially depending on the partisan politics in a given state. So when you have a place that's heavily Democratic in that period, you are not going to be able to make the same kind of progress. So and then in the middle of all this, right, the Federal Fugitive Slave Act is passed. That is very intimidating to African Americans already living in the North, because people who are actually fugitive slaves can be picked up and dragged back into the South, but so can free black people who don't have any real rights before the courts at this time. So we see a lot of African Americans in the North leaving for Canada in this time period, just trying to get out of this country, and a lot of sense of like hopelessness that, you know, this is not really a place for us. In the middle of all of this, Indiana, kind of under the same impulses, has a constitutional convention and actually does what Illinois did not do, bars black migration into the state by state constitution. Then 2 years later, Illinois passes what was mentioned earlier, the Logan Law, barring by statute black migration into this state. And I want to say a little more about that. So John Logan, who was mentioned earlier, a representative from Southern Illinois, was the author of this black exclusion law. He pushed hard for it in the state legislature. And its passage reflects that Illinois was really trying to double down on this idea that not only were they trying to be sort of oppressive to African Americans within the state, but they were trying to send a message that they didn't want any more to come into the state. Now, because there was already a movement, a civil rights movement, if you will, in the state, there was a lot of pushback against this law. So in some ways, I mean, first of all, there's a lot of evidence that the law itself was not very strictly enforced. And secondly, there are all kinds of newspapers by this time, kind of Whig newspapers, anti-slavery newspapers, but also some Democratic newspapers who say, this is crazy, we've gone too far. This new law is giving our state a bad reputation throughout the country. We cannot enforce it. It's inhumane. We don't want to be doing what the slaveholders of Kentucky want us to do. We're our own state. We don't want to have to do what they think we should be doing. And so there's a huge reaction, actually, and a very political reaction against this black law, this new version of it. But this new law is also the impetus for the 1853 convention in Chicago, which I started with, right? So it's after all of this kind of agitation and this repressive new law that black Illinoisans gather for the first time in a statewide convention to talk about what to do. From there, they're going to lobby the state legislature for repeal, and I'll get to when repeal of those laws actually happens. All right, so what about our friend Mr. Lincoln? So Lincoln was coming into politics in the 1850s when these laws were on the books in Illinois. And I want to talk a little bit about the famous Lincoln-Douglas debates. Lincoln never spoke publicly against the black laws of Illinois, and he had plenty of opportunities to do so, but he did voice some of the principles of the first civil rights movement in the late 1850s. So first of all, his opponent, Stephen Douglas. In 1850, Senator Douglas defended the Illinois Constitution's black exclusion clause on the floor of the U.S. Senate, arguing that it was among the police regulations needed for the quiet and peace of our community. As Tim alluded to earlier, in the debates in 1858, Douglas maintained the position, and I quote, that the United States was, quote, made by the white man for the benefit of the white man, to be administered by white men in such matter as they should determine. And Douglas argued that the founders had intended that the Declaration of Independence was for white men only, and he often said, I am opposed to Negro citizenship in any and every form. So that's Douglas. So Lincoln said from time to time things like, I don't support political or social equality of the races, But unlike Douglas, in the late 1850s, Lincoln did insist that the Declaration of Independence was meant for all people, and that people of African descent explicitly were equal in their right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So Lincoln is a really sharp contrast to Stephen Douglas in this. Many of the first civil rights movement activists, however, were frustrated with Lincoln that he wouldn't go further and condemn the black laws of the state of Illinois. And I like to cite an African-American activist named H. Ford Douglass, who spent time in Illinois during the course of his career. And I just think it's useful to have a third position, because we're very used to talking about there's Lincoln and there's Douglas, and they are a contrast. But H. Ford Douglass in 1860, while Lincoln was the nominee for president, he was, let's just put it this way, he was kind of to the left of the Republican Party, right, or to kind of the progressive side of the Republican Party. So H. Ford Douglass went around criticizing leading Republicans for accepting the constitutional order as it stood. And in 1860, he said publicly that he, in 1858, 2 years earlier, had asked both Lincoln and Illinois Republican Senator Lyman Trumbull to sign a petition opposing the black laws, and both had refused. And that was part of H. Ford Douglass's sort of criticism of the leading Republicans, that they're not doing enough for racial equality. So, and unlike Lincoln, many leading white Republicans of this period were actually involved in the first civil rights movement. And all of these men, Salmon Chase, George Julian, Henry Wilson, John Bingham, Schuyler Colfax, William Seward, all of them actually were on record being part of this movement in one way or another, doing things that advanced the demands for repeal of the black laws of various states, advocating for black men's right to vote at the state level. And so we do have examples of these men who end up being in very prominent positions among Republicans in the 1860s who were involved in this movement. And to me, this is really key to my whole book, and because it helps explain that question that I started with, which is, how did you end up with a critical mass of white Northerners coming into federal power in 1860, 1861, who actually believed in racial equality in some measure? And I would argue that part of the reason they did was because they had been involved in this movement, because they knew about these antebellum struggles in the free states, because they had pushed for repeal of black laws, because they knew African Americans who were involved in this movement and understood the justice of what they were seeking. And the thing about the Civil War and Reconstruction is that it provided new opportunities for policymaking at the federal level. So when the Republicans, which are the first anti-slavery party in the United States to ever make it into national power, when they get into power and a bunch of southern states secede from the Union and they have a majority in Congress and the president, right, they can do things that nobody has ever done before in the United States government. And they do, and they apply those principles that they took from the first civil rights movement, ideas about racial equality and civil rights, and they apply them to the federal government, and they apply them through in the places where the federal government has power. So I'm going to have to wrap up, I think. But I want to, let's see. So this helps explain, in my view, where these views came from, and it helps explain some aspects of Reconstruction policy, right? So to just really briefly, so in 1866, Congress passes the first ever federal civil rights law. That is a product of this kind of thinking about racial equality. I have this slide because there's a famous moment in 1865 as the Civil War ends when the abolitionists have a meeting. And William Lloyd Garrison was there, and Frederick Douglass was there, and a whole lot of other people were there. It was in New York City. And they're basically debating, like, well, slavery is abolished, the 13th Amendment is on its way to ratification. Is our work done? After all, this was an anti-slavery movement. So, you know, are we like done and dusted, or are we supposed to continue with the work? And Garrison said, hooray for us, we're done, we can retire from activism now. And Frederick Douglass said, oh no, we have already seen what it's like to have slavery abolished, and have anti-black policies, because that was what it was like in Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio. And so we have to keep going. It's not enough to just abolish slavery. We have to keep going and make sure that people's rights are protected on a level of equality. And I think Frederick Douglass was really prescient and really talking about what needed to happen during Reconstruction, and what indeed the federal government did try to do during Reconstruction. Briefly, what happens in Illinois? Finally, under Republican control of the state legislature, the legislature repeals the Illinois Black Laws, effective February 7th, 1865, about a week after the state became the first state to ratify the 13th Amendment. And this was widely covered in the newspapers, the repeal of the Black Laws. There were celebrations in a lot of places throughout the state. I personally would like, and let me say it especially clearly here in Springfield, ever since I started working on this, I want there to be a state holiday. February 7th should be a state holiday, because this is a really important moment in the history of this state, the repeal of the Black Laws. And I think it allows, having a state holiday of February 7th would allow us to talk about both the reality of those Black Laws and what they represented, and the nobility and the triumph of the repeal of them and what that represented. So I love that idea, and we'll talk about it with anyone who wants to talk about it with me. Indiana, at the point that the Civil Rights Act of 1866 made all of these state laws unconstitutional, or violating federal law, only Indiana still had its laws on the books when the 1866 federal civil rights law went into effect, and essentially meant that Indiana's law was now in violation of federal law. All right, so I guess that kind of wraps up that part. I think understanding the first civil rights movement in this country expands our view on the kind of issues that were being discussed and debated in Lincoln's milieu, right, that he knew about, that he was engaged with. And it also sheds new light on the long history of struggles over kind of questions of race and racism in this country. And of course, it also helps us better understand what this country attempted to do during Reconstruction, right? The significance and the magnitude of it. And so that's the end of that. And I just want to say a couple tiny things about my recent book, this graphic history. So as I said before, I got into history because I was really interested in Reconstruction, and I was able to come back to this through actually a wonderful person who retired from the National Park Service named Dean Herron. Got a grant within the Park Service to work on a graphic history of Reconstruction in the DC region. And Bill gave a little preview of it when he introduced me, but this is like a cartoon history, okay? And it is designed for people ages 16 and up, but it is quite appealing to many adults, I will say. And it is grounded in deep research. It is a nonfiction. It's about real people. So the narrator of the book is a black woman named Emma Brown, and on the left is an actual photo of her, and then on the right is how the illustrator for the book, Liz Clark, drew her as both a character and a narrator. And this just gives you a sense of some of the illustrations. So it's got more than 80 pages of illustrations telling a variety of historically true stories about the period of Reconstruction. It covers some of the things some of the unhappy history that Tim was describing, including arsons of black schools. It discusses one particular lynching that occurred in Maryland in the early 1880s. And so it's kind of it's a very real history. It's not a juvenile history, but it's a very real history that delivers a lot of information about Reconstruction in a way that we hope is really accessible to younger readers or to older readers who just enjoy mixing their words with pictures. And so that just tells you what's in the book. So if you're interested in it, I have a copy of it here, but unfortunately it's not for sale, but I've got one right here, and I'd love to talk with you all about it. Thank you so much.